other three inverse trig functions. We've learned about inverse sine, inverse cosine, inverse tangent. The other three trig functions also have inverses, and they also have restrictions. So, for example, the inverse cosecant function only knows about angles between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. That's easy to remember. It's the same as the inverse sine function. The inverse secant function only knows about angles between 0 and pi. Once again, same as the inverse cosine function. The only one that's a little different is the inverse cotangent function. The inverse cotangent function also only knows about angles between 0 and pi. Notice the parentheses at the ends because 0 and pi are themselves undefined for the cotangent function. This is not the same as inverse tangent. The reason here is that we want to choose one complete cycle of the cotangent function, and one complete cycle takes place between 0 and pi. As long as we can reference these restrictions, we can make sense of the calculations. So let's try some. We'll try to work these out by hand if possible, and we'll give radian answers. So the first one says cosecant inverse of 2. Remember, in the inverse trig functions, it's the ratios going in, and it's an angle that's coming out. 2 doesn't really look like a ratio. I can make it look like one by putting a 1 underneath there. If I have any hope to work this out by hand, I can always attempt to draw a reference triangle picture. Let's see, inverse cosecant only knows about angles between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. That's quadrants 1 or 4. It's a positive ratio, so I should draw it in quadrant 1. Here's the angle I'm looking for. The cosecant ratio is 2 over 1. Cosecant is hypotenuse over opposite. Or another way I could have thought of it, if the cosecant ratio is 2 over 1, then of course the sine ratio must be 1 over 2. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Well, we've drawn this triangle many times. It's just our typical 30, 60, 90 triangle here. This is the 30-degree angle opposite the 1. That's the angle we're interested in. In radians, that would be pi over 6. Okay, let's look at the second one. Secant inverse of 1. Again, the 1 is a ratio. It's the secant ratio. Well, it's often helpful to think more in terms of the big three. If the secant ratio is 1, 1 over 1 is still 1. That means the cosine ratio is 1. And when I hear a number like 1 for cosine, 1 or 0, I'm immediately thinking then of the unit circle. I should think of that 1 for the cosine function as a coordinate. Now let's see, where on the unit circle am I looking? I'm only looking in the section from 0 to pi. That's for both inverse secant and inverse cosine. I need a spot on this circle where the cosine coordinate would be 1. Well, cosine is the a value. This is the only spot on the entire unit circle that has an a value of 1, the point 1, 0. Obviously, this is simply 0 radians, and that would be my answer. We're saying 0 radians is the angle that has both a cosine and a secant value of 1. And then let's look at this last one, cotangent inverse of 3/10. Well, cotangent inverse only knows about angles between 0 and pi. So if I wanted to try to draw a picture here, 0 and pi, that's quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. My ratio is positive, so I'll draw it in quadrant 1. Let's see, cotangent is adjacent over opposite. I've drawn a picture, but I don't recognize this as one of our special triangles, which means I don't have any way to work this one out by hand. I'll have to go to the calculator. Here's the problem though. I don't have a cotangent inverse button on my calculator. In order to use the calculator, I'm going to have to switch this over to one of the big three functions. And of course, for cotangent inverse, I can easily switch over to tangent inverse. In the first quadrant, if the cotangent ratio is 3 over 10, then the tangent ratio is 10 over 3, right? Opposite over adjacent. Calculating the tangent inverse function for 10/3 will give me the answer that I want. It gives me that same angle that we drew. Well, I can easily do that in the calculator. Tangent inverse in blue above the tangent button. Type in 10/3. Hit enter. We are in radian mode, and so here is our first quadrant angle we were interested in, about 1.279. That's the angle whose tangent ratio is 10/3, or equivalently, whose cotangent ratio is 3/10. Thanks for watching.